Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're here to talk about ESG, or Environment, Social and Governance, Integrity and Scrutiny. Now, ESG is a topic which everybody is speaking about now, whether it's because your stakeholders are asking you for more information or regulators are looking at how you're disclosing information, and whether you're actually being truthful or having an impact with your ESG data. So today we have with us four amazing panelists who are going to look at, from different perspectives, how their organizations are addressing ESG data, integrity, and scrutiny. I'm Dr. Darian McBain. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer and now Advisor to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and I'll be moderating the session today. I'll introduce our four panelists after we first have an introductory remarks and speech from His Excellency Kun Akom Tumpitiapase, the Minister of Finance for Thailand.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank AIIB for inviting me to this auspicious event. It is my great pleasure to deliver the opening speech at the annual meeting's thematic webinar on environmental, social and governance, or ESG, integrity and scrutiny. I'm certain that this webinar would provide a comprehensive set of ideas for ESG integrity and scrutiny for members of AIIB, including Thailand and all stakeholders. Distinguished participants, after a tough few years of spending a lot of resources to fight against COVID-19, the livelihood of people has more or less returned to normal. And now it is time to turn our attention to long-term development that takes into account both economic growth and sustainability. Accordingly, there are currently several development trends towards sustainability, including net zero carbon emissions, circular economy, renewable and alternative energy, and zero waste. In the financial sector, the concept of sustainable finance has come to the fore, with ESG being the topic of significant discussion over the years. Numerous organizations and financial institutions have also integrated ESG goals into their business strategy. Taking an ESG approach in line with SDG Agenda 2030 is one of the most effective ways to improve our quality of life and create opportunities for everyone to participate in and benefit from sustainable development and to achieve the AIIB mission. In this regard, I would like to take this opportunity to briefly share some insights on how we implement aspects of ESG for sustainable development in Thailand. The government of Thailand has successfully issued the Sustainability Bond in August 2020, the first of its kind in ASEAN, with total amount of 30 billion baht to support the mass transit orange line and COVID-19 relief package. Since then, the Ministry of Finance has continued to issue a sustainability bond to solidify the success and ensure liquidity of bond in the market. Presently, the total sustainability bond outstanding size is 247 billion baht. In addition, we have completed the development of Sustainable Finance Initiative for Thailand by collaborating between Thailand's financial regulators. This initiative serves as a framework for driving sustainable finance across the financial sector. In 2015, the Stock Exchange of Thailand, or SET, created the Thailand Sustainability Investment, or THSI list, a list of Thai listed companies with notable ESG initiatives. To promote such companies, the SET defines sustainable companies as those that embrace risk management, supply chain management, innovation, and responsibility for ESG. By the end of 2021, 145 companies were featured on the THSI list, and this number is gradually increasing. Ladies and gentlemen, in working towards sustainable development, the public sector cannot go it alone. Rather, it needs cooperation from the private sector and multilateral development banks in moving closer to SDG 17, which is Partnership for the Goals. I'm fully aware that AIIB has an environmental and social framework, or ESF, that aims to provide a framework for planning and management the risk and environmental and social impacts of AIIB projects. Therefore, I'm quite assured that AIIB and this webinar will be the place where everyone can exchange experiences and constructive views on the development of ESG integrity and scrutiny to create a more sustainable, more connected, cleaner, and greener world. Finally, from Thailand, I convey you my best wishes for your good health, your success in this webinar, and your future endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those encouraging words. And I can certainly say from first-hand experience how the work of the Stock Exchange of Thailand really did help to drive corporates' behaviours with respect to ESG and sustainability. Now, I would love to introduce our panellists for today. So going in order, we have Ms. Yulin Fang, Partner and Sustainability and Climate Change Leader from PwC Singapore. Welcome, Yulin. We have Mr. Sean Kidney, CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Mr. Nicholas Tan, Chief Operating Officer, Bayfront Infrastructure Management, and Dr. Joachim von Amsberg, Special Advisor to the President of AIIB. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today. So let's get down to the topic of ESG. So a growing number of stakeholders are asking for more details about ESG in each of your own organisations. What are those expectations for stakeholders? What are they asking of you? And perhaps tell me some of the standards that you are using to help demystify what ESG means. Yulin, perhaps we can turn to you first, please.
Thank you, Darian, and just wanted to wish everybody, good afternoon or good morning or good evening as well, and to thank as well the AIIB for this kind invitation. I think that's a great question, Darian, and I think that the sustainability reporting standards are moving very fast. Of course, we've got the GRI who has been there, since 1997, and so have been around for quite some time. But there are other standards as well, which are newer, such as the ISSB, of which we await the finalization of their exposure drafts as well. But your question around what are stakeholders expecting, maybe I would like to also just share a little bit more about what I've been seeing as an advisor. You might be familiar with the Economist magazine. Around the end of July, they had an article on ESG, and it was called ESG, 3 Letters That Won't Save the Planet. And it was, I wouldn't say it was a very positive feature, but there were comments around and also intolerance around poor data quality. It's not as high as financial data, and also ESG ratings as well. And also the question of whether or not the ESG investments really outperform a normal type of investments, and of course the plethora of different kinds of standards as well. But I kind of get it. I do get that the expectation for stakeholders at this point in time is that they really want standards, good standards, which are also a common baseline, but at the same time as well, they want good data as well. But I have to say that the standard setters, they are setting high standards. You might have known in the past few days, the ISSB has also unanimously voted for Scope 3 emissions to be included as well. But I also just want to recognize that whilst there is some demand from the stakeholders in terms of getting better standards and better data, I have to say that the parties in the ecosystem are really trying their best at breakneck speed to make all of this happen. You see from the standards such as GRI, the ISSB frameworks such as the TCFD, the TNFD, they're all coming together alongside as well, the auditing standards. And of course, as what the minister shared, there are different countries, including in Southeast Asia, who are committing higher commitments as well, including in Singapore, which we just released. And I have to say that, we are moving at breakneck speed in line with those kind of expectations. Hopefully, when the jigsaw puzzle will come along nicely and not too long. So I would say that in this area, the heart is willing and the flesh is willing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. So we're hearing it's a jigsaw. Sean, from your perspective, how are you seeing the demands from stakeholders for ESG and data and disclosures, and what are some of those standards that you're referring to?
Look, there are two things going on here, and those two things are colliding. One of those, the origins of what we typically call ESG, is essentially around bringing in a range of other risk factors to try and assess our performance, as we were hearing about a minute ago, or what's going to perform better over the longer term. Typically, ESG criteria are tied to longer-term performance as an antidote to short-term performance in volatile markets, etc. This is where, governance measures can be a predictor of long-term performance, but they won't necessarily be a predictor of short-term performance, if you like. But against that, there's something else that's happened in the last few years, which is an appreciation that there are some macro priorities, notably around climate change, hence that Economist article about the E and ESG, emissions and so on. So, when I started work in this particular space, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, great as it was, had a best-in-class coal plants. Now, I don't think you can get away from best-in-class coal plants anymore, although there has been some controversy about some ESG funds in the last year having best-in-class fossil fuel companies and so on, because the background is that the climate change scientists that are informing our global understanding of what we have to do in relation to an environment are telling us you can't have coal plants at all. There's just no space, nada, impossible. So you can't have a best-in-class. It's not a relative predictor of performance. It's that there are some now absolutes we have to deal with in terms of how we change. In the work we've been doing at the Climate Bonds Initiative globally, it's been very much focused on trying to flesh that out. So we've worked on things like taxonomies, which are complements to the industry-led reporting and transparency standards that have been a kind of bridge between ESG and the climate world. The taxonomy work, and as you would know, China has a green projects catalogue, Europe has a EU taxonomy, we have the common ground taxonomy between the two, and we have similar projects in about 30 other countries around the world at the moment, are essentially a shopping list for the future. This is quite different to the historical application of ESG frameworks. This is not about relative best. This is about saying, actually, this is what we have to do. We need to build a lot more electric rail. We need to stop building fossil fuel transports. They've got to just disappear. There's no best in class available in this kind of framing. And that's the way, I think at the moment we have a bit of a clash of methodologies and approaches here that we need to work through in terms of our understanding of what ESG means. And that, I guess, is the background of that idea that it's the E in ESG that counts. Now, I'm not going to say that, because I'm going to say that as we start looking at climate, including absolutes of what we have to do, there are some absolutes on the social and the governance side as well. We need to prepare our societies for climate change. We are in the midst of climate change. Look at the horrendous drought and heat incidences in Sichuan this year, and the floods in Pakistan. These are live climate change incidents, exacerbated by other measures, not building dams enough in Pakistan. But there's no doubt that the extremity of the experiences of people in those regions has been because of climate change. We've got to prepare. Now, that will involve not just physical, but also social, economic, and ecosystem measures, as the pandemic had shown, which is something that's been predicted by climate science for 30 years. There's a whole social and governance-related aspect to the extension of taxonomy. So over the coming year, what you will see is a fleshing out of criteria in a different kind of way to the relativist approaches in ESG that we've seen in the past, into absolutes, the expansion of taxonomies around the world as guidance for what to do to address these extraordinary challenges we face. That's a bit of a difference. That's what we're doing.
Thank you. I love the concept that a taxonomy is a shopping list for the future. I think it really does give a different framing. Nicholas, perhaps if I can turn to you, what are you getting the sense of from your stakeholders, and what are the standards that you're referring to?
Sure. Before I dive into that, maybe just to set the scene, give a quick introduction about Bayfront Infrastructure. For those that on the webinar are not familiar with us, we are a Singapore-based asset manager that's focused on infrastructure debt. Our mandate is to help mobilize institutional participation into infrastructure financing and help banks recycle capital from long-dated infrastructure loans. So we are 70% owned by the Clifford Capital Holdings Group and 30% by the AIIB, and we benefit from a $1.8 billion funding guarantee from the government of Singapore, which allows us to fund on the back of Singapore's AAA rating. So we utilize this balance sheet to acquire infrastructure loans from banks. We warehouse them before transferring them into our distribution vehicles that issues structured notes to institutional investors. So we term these notes as infrastructure asset-backed securities, or IABS in short. So as you can imagine, one of the key stakeholder groups for us would be the institutional investor base that participates in our IABS issuances. So I can share some color on how their expectations for ESG diligence and demand for sustainable investments have increased over time. For example, on the first topic, back in 2018, when we marketed our first IABS transaction, we saw that some institutional investors were still comfortable generally with core assets being included in our portfolio. But fast forward to 2021, when we marketed our second transaction, core was pretty much a non-starter for any discussion. And we also noticed a growing focus by investors on how we conducted ESG diligence for each of the underlying assets that we seek to onboard. So the fact that we were able to tell investors at the point in time that we have developed a robust ESG framework and core is very much part of the exclusion list provided a lot of comfort for investors with regards to the standard of ESG diligence that we undertake. Other than diligence, we also observe a material increase in interest from institutional investors for sustainability-related investments. So in response, we structured a dedicated sustainability tranche that's backed by a portfolio of eligible green and social assets within the portfolio on a use of proceeds basis. This was first featured as part of our BIC2 issuance in 2021, and we repeated that again in our most recent issuance, BIC3, that we closed last month. In both issuances, the sustainability tranche was very well received and was oversubscribed, which enabled us to price the tranche at 5 basis points tighter compared to its conventional counterpart within the transaction. So going forward, I think that investors will continue to demand more and more rigor in relation to diligence. Will also demand more and more of such sustainability-related issuances. So we will need to work harder to source for these green and social assets from the market to back these issuances. The other key group of stakeholders for us would be our shareholders, as I mentioned earlier, Clifford Capital and AIIB. Both of them are extremely focused, as you can imagine, on our ESG and sustainability strategy, given the profile that they have. From a risk perspective, we are expected to maintain a very low tolerance for ESG risks. This is very well documented within our internal policies and procedures, including our risk appetite statement. We have an E&S framework that I mentioned earlier, which we are expected to apply to all our transactions. In fact, we have 2 ESG committees that we have to report to on a quarterly basis, one at the Bayfront level and the other at the CCH group level. So you can imagine that there is a lot of accountability expected from a governance perspective. And finally, climate risk, as you can imagine, is another aspect our shareholders and board members are very much focused on. So we worked with McKinsey and Moody's to develop a climate strategy that's very much aligned to TCFD guidelines this year, and also outline a roadmap to implement this strategy over the next 6 to 18 months. I expect that this strategic pivot will consequentially shape our portfolio selection going forward, which will lead to a reduction in our carbon intensity over time. And this is something that will be closely monitored and tracked by our ESG committees going forward.
Great, thank you. So we've heard a number of different standards now. We heard from Yulin about ISSB and GRI. Sean mentioned taxonomies. Nicholas, you just mentioned TCFD. Joaquim, from your perspective and the AIIB, I mean, what are the standards that are driving the work that you're doing, and what are you getting as the feedback from stakeholders on where they expect you to be performing?
So the AIIB is, of course, a multilateral development bank and part of this very particular group of financial institutions. Our shareholders are more than 100 governments around the world. And just like in the other multilateral development banks, our shareholders have given us a mandate to pursue social and economic sustainable development, rather than a mandate to maximize profit accruing to our shareholders. So we are quite special in that regard, because development, broadly defined, is at the core of our mission and our mandate. And development, social economic development, of course, has as its core ESG issues. Social issues, of course, because it is all about the well-being of people. That's what development is all about. Environment, because the environment directly influences the well-being of people today and tomorrow. And then governance, because we know how corruption and fraud, for example, can prevent the benefits of investments to actually accrue to the people. So to us, ESG is really at the core of our business rather than an add-on that came later. So we care, because of our mandate, about the ultimate impact of financings we are pursuing on people, on the environment. And not just because of the impact on the financial viability of projects, but because of the intrinsic importance of financings for the well-being of people. Now, the reason why multilateral development banks have put ESG standards and requirements into their financing for several decades is, of course, a recognition that public policies in this area are imperfect. In particular in developing countries, but I think in countries all over the world, government policies are evolving, but they have gaps, they have insufficiencies, especially with regard to new issues that are emerging, such as climate change. And because these public policies are insufficient or incomplete and imperfect, it has been recognized by our shareholders that attaching environmental and social standards and governance standards to the financing is another way of improving the performance of investments on ESG and ultimately improve the well-being of people. So multilateral development banks, starting with the World Bank, really for 30 years, starting in the late 80s and then advancing in the early 90s, have developed ESG standards, or safeguards as they were originally called, to their financing. And I think really developed a very rich body of experiences to draw from for those who are have come later to this discussion and are starting to look at how to take these issues seriously into consideration. Now, AIIB is a new multilateral development bank. We were founded in 2015, opened our doors for business in 2016. So we have been able to build our system on the experience of our peer multilateral development banks, and that they have experienced over more than 30 years. So our environmental and social framework is very much modeled after and built on that long-standing experience of MDBs. The main elements of that framework are, first, the classification of projects by risk category to ensure that we pay the highest attention in our ESG due diligence to the most risky projects. We have clear guidelines about how to undertake due diligence in the preparation and then in the implementation of environmental, social, and governance standards in our projects. We have standards on environmental and social assessment, on land acquisition and resettlement, which is one of the most challenging and important topics in infrastructure financing, which is the core of our business. And we have a standard on indigenous peoples and their protection. Now, most recently, we have added requirements on climate change and announced our commitment that all of our financings have to be aligned with the Paris Agreement by the middle of next year. And behind that announcement stands a methodology that has been agreed by the multilateral development banks of what Paris alignment means. For example, no-call financing is one of those basic principles of that methodology, but then also goes into great detail of how to assess Paris alignment of other energy and other sector investments. To turn to the governance side, our policies include sets of requirements on public procurement as an area which is particularly prone to I think, weaknesses in the implementation of governance. And so our requirements for internationally competitive bidding, transparency and procurement is meant to ensure high efficiency of procurement and low risks of corruption. And we have a policy to prevent what we call prohibited practices, which include issues like corruption, fraud in our operations. So all these requirements and standards that I mentioned are part of every financing that AIIB undertakes. They're binding ourselves as a multilateral development financier, and they're binding our borrowers who are signing up to these standards when they are taking on AIIB financing. So again, ESG has been really at the core of our business from our founding just some 6 years ago.
Great, thank you. And it was very interesting to hear you talking about development at its core has a social impact to it. And Nicholas spoke very much about risks, but it's great to hear about AIIB talking with more respect for impact and how you can have an impact through ESG work. Perhaps if we can pivot now to talk about another very topical subject, which is greenwashing. I think, we could all think of examples of, some large financial institutions and some corporate brands and service providers who have been very publicly caught out for greenwashing. And by which I mean representing something as being more sustainable than it actually is. I could distinctly remember when there was a brand that was selling a kind of beauty product, and the outer casing was in cardboard, and it said, "This is not a plastic bottle," but if you opened up the cardboard packaging, in fact, inside there was a plastic bottle. So that would be an example, very practical, of greenwashing. Yulin and Sean, maybe if I can call on you first. How do you identify if there is greenwashing? And how can you avoid it to make ESG reporting actually meaningful? Yulin.
Thanks, Darian. And I think I know which advertisement you are talking about. Yes, I think that example was actually quite telling. The good news is that I think now there are more people who are a little bit more afraid on the ESG topic and are able to kind of highlight, right, when things are not, as it seems. So that's the good thing. But maybe before I answer your question, I'd like to also just acknowledge what everyone else on the panel was saying around social risks, right? And I think that many said that, well, you can talk about environmental risks, and I think this is what Sean said just now as well, but what about the social? And I would like to, just reiterate that point as well, that's super important. It's all part of the SDGs as well. And, the social side of things is connected to the environmental side of things, as, many of, the studies have shown, from the IPCC, AR6 report, to the SDG interconnectedness, to the World Economic Forum risk reports. The social risks are definitely connected to the environmental risks. And whilst I know we're talking about greenwashing, I think, one of the key things that companies, governments need to keep in mind, as well as the comprehensiveness in terms of their impact as well. So that's one thing that I like to highlight, the comprehensiveness of the impacts that they're making and the complexity and interconnectedness of that as well. The one thing I think is useful to try to minimize the risk of a greenwashing, and sometimes as it relates to SDGs, some call it rainbow washing, is that one thing is that you can really try to make sure that you anchor it in science, right? So if you're talking about emissions, and I know one of the key things is that can you anchor it in science-based targets, right? That's one thing. So use these amazing platforms, as well-established, very thorough platforms to make those kind of commitments. That's one. And the other area as well is that I think it's really important to understand the framework that you're using. So in the early days, it was quite common for companies to actually align their efforts towards the SDG goal level. That's just one example. But actually, that underneath those 17 goals are 169 targets. That's the one that really matters. So that's one. But at the same time, different countries also have different, what I call, needs as well, right? So you really need to connect those needs to those specific country needs as well. But I'll come back as well to what are some ways we can reduce the risk of greenwashing. This is something which I believe that many reporters are looking into, which is around assurance or audits. As the standards are being developed, whether it's the ISSB or other standards under the EFRAG or the SEC, alongside are also assurance standards which are being developed. We are all very familiar with the assurance standards as it relates to financial reporting. And now the assurance standards as it relates to ESG is now being further developed as well. And I think in record speed too. If you look at the principles of what really matters in terms of ESG reporting, comparability, verifiability, timeliness, understandability, having that kind of assurance or that eye over those kind of attributes, I think is super important. It not only gives trust in relation to general sustainability reporting, but because this data in terms of the sustainability reporting is used in other areas, such as in finance, such as in ESG ratings, I think it's super important. I'll just have a last point to make is that ever since I've been in sustainability, I found it to be very interesting, but also challenging as well. I used to come from the finance world, and in the finance world, you have very much, well-walked paths, right? You have standards, you have frameworks, you have check boxes, right? And it's if you just follow those, you get to the conclusion. But in this area, I think that the standards sometimes are not finalized yet, although they are moving very fast. What's super important is actually to rely on good principles that have aided companies, that have aided governments in the past. So I'll give you an example. For example, we have been trying to figure out as well, how is it that, what's the best practice in terms of accounting for carbon credits or sustainable aviation fuels? The accounting standards for that are not out yet, but I think we can rely on the principles of other accounting standards to draw inspiration to apply to those kind of problem sets as well. When you talk about, say, portfolio emissions, what can you count as reductive, removal, or actually impact? I think, there are quite a number of papers out there we have written by financial institutions and academics that you can rely on as well, and take the best of it to your problem set.
Okay. Thank you, Yulin. Briefly, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sean, from your perspective.
I tend to focus on financial markets and investments, and there's a whole world of retail madness out there, as you identified, Darian, which I won't go into. But on the financial markets, a few years ago, a college building authority in the US issued a bond, $110 million. And I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as calling it a pathetic green bond. Now, why did I do that? Because 25% of the proceeds were allocated to a parking garage. Interesting. I had a look at this. 75% went to green buildings. It was perfectly good. The parking garage was rated bronze green by an organisation that was apparently set up by the American Parking Association. That is the Association of Parking Garages. Didn't look very solid and only got a bronze. And I thought that was a bit weak. Now, I actually, afterwards, being a bit embarrassed by the nature of the quote in the Wall Street Journal, took myself along to meet the CEO of the relevant organisation to say hi, because, you know, you've got to engage, right? We all must engage and discuss these things. And he just didn't know. He quizzed me about climate change for an hour, and we became good friends. He said, all right, now I know. Okay, I get it. In fact, later on, he sent his daughter along to become an intern in our organisation. But the point was he didn't know. It wasn't clear what it could, because most people don't know. The science is challenging. As Yulin says, we need to have the science in the room here. Now, this is the difference between, as I said earlier, between ESG best in class versus science direction about what really needs to be done. So most stuff that is called greenwashing is where claims have been made that are not adequate to the challenge that we face. Oh, I'm reducing my plastics usage by 15%. Sounds really good. But when you consider the amount of plastics we have to reduce, it's pretty marginal. I remember a goods packaging company once who announced that they were reducing the plastic wrapper around their plastic water bottles. And they wanted to get a green credit and see if they could do a green bond against it. And I said, look, it's great they're reducing the usage of plastic in your supply chain, but at the end of the day, it's water in a plastic bottle. We can't escape that. And that's going to be a bit challenging. Now, guidance is what we try to do in taxonomies around the world to show, I used the term earlier, a shopping list for the future, to make it easier for everyone. Because some of this sort of stuff is hard. What is good enough in industry? What is good enough in agriculture? What, in fact, have we got to do in agriculture to make sure that we both address mitigation, sequestration as the big opportunity in agriculture, and address resilience? Oh, I don't know. That's why I've got a team of people and technical working groups as scientists to help us to buy these things. So I'm going to say the key greenwashing is inadequate ambition as a result of simply not getting it. You know, I remember the CEO of an oil company who did a good bond, very clear, but it just wasn't adequately ambitious because there wasn't a significant improvement in the oil and gas aspects of their business. They needed to be investing in renewables, not trying to marginally improve their gas plants. That's an understanding of what the implications of climate science really are. There are other kinds of greenwashing, no doubt about it. There is the greenwashing where someone just lies. Very rare, but it does happen. We know that. We've got to call that out. And thank goodness we have NGOs like the Greenpeaces and the World Wildlife Funds who are able to call those things out for us. We've got to watch for that. Regulation will improve that. But in the financial sector, it's tiny.
Lie is an important step.
You know, an example is a property developer in Syracuse, New York, who issued a green bond in 2008 to do a green shopping centre, and they didn't bother. Too hard. So just built an ordinary shopping centre. Eventually, it took an investigative journalist to uncover that, and there's a whole story behind that one. That's the only direct scam in the green bond market that I've come across, that I'm aware of so far. But, you know, clearly it does happen. We have to be on guard at that. The real problem is a lack of understanding of what it is that we have to do. And that we're working on with things like taxonomies and guidance. We need to have science in the room. It is no longer good enough to think, oh, that looks good, either as a politician or as an investor or a corporate. We need to make sure it's properly backed up by the science in terms of what we need to do. And I will tell you, there is a gap. Like those best-in-class coal companies that used to be in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, there is unfortunately no room for coal companies in the future that we have to create for our children. That's just an absolute now. It's not a best-in-class approach. So I think they're the key things.
Okay, so let's be guided by the science and be thankful for the role of civil society with NGOs and investigative journalists to actually keep everybody honest. Now, I'll just say a call out to the audience. We will soon be moving on to some questions. So if you've thought of any questions, please do post them in the chat and we'll be getting to those soon. So briefly, Nicholas and Joaquim, we'll turn to you. If you could, first of all, give a brief response, building on what Yulin and Sean have said about greenwashing, how you identify it and how you can overcome that. And then I might switch to another question about, how we could look at partnerships. So Nicholas, over to you first.
Sure. I think building on what Yulin and Sean has talked about, I mean, sometimes it's just as simple as the terms being used. I mean, a lot of times, I think terms like ESG, sustainability, climate, they're being used kind of interchangeably, right? And they don't always mean the same thing in different contexts, right? So I think it's important for us to differentiate very clearly between, when we're using specific terms. For example, at Bayfront, we differentiate very clearly between what we meant by sustainable investing and ESG risk assessment. On sustainable investing, we refer to our sustainable finance framework, which outline the types of eligible green and social assets that we can acquire, which we in turn use to back our sustainability issuances. Our sustainable finance framework is then aligned with the IGMA principles and ACMF standards that looks at a variety of sectors such as renewable energy, clean transportation, energy efficiency, affordable basic infrastructure, and others. And then we overlay that with a second-party opinion from a reputable provider in DMV to ensure that we get a credible opinion that would stand up to the rigor enforced by the market. And we've done the same for impact reporting as well, whereby we have appointed corporate citizenship to support us in deriving the impact matrix. Whereas on the other hand, we utilize, I mentioned earlier, our ENS framework for the purpose of our ESG risk assessment. So this is something that we apply for every asset that we seek to onboard in our portfolio, whether they are green, social, or conventional. So it's not just limited to sustainable assets. Our framework is aligned with international and multilateral standards like the Equator Principles, the AIIB ENS framework, IFC performance standards, but drafted to fit our business model, which is generally focused on acquiring loans on a secondary basis from banks. So we focus in this aspect on identifying and managing any residual ENS risks associated with the project, such as the proper application of the project's ESMS, compliance with the relevant EHS laws and regulations, potential impact on biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, we're pretty methodical in relation to how we bucket the different approaches that we have in different frameworks so that it's very clear to our investors, to our stakeholders on how we approach things to avoid any form of confusion or misunderstanding in relation to how we're branding certain things.
Okay, so that clarity of approach is clearly important for communicating with your stakeholders. Joaquim, how about from your perspective?
Well, to take that off the table, lying, deception, misrepresentation, all that clearly unacceptable and unduly give a bad name to ESG efforts. So let's take that off the table and not let sort of the few black sheep spoil what is overall an absolutely important and critical effort that we support. But frankly, it is natural that this discussion is complex because the underlying issues are diverse and complex. And it starts with diversity of objectives and goes then to the complexity of the underlying ESG issues. On the objectives, even on this panel, you may have noticed that there are at least two different perspectives on the ultimate objectives of an ESG approach in financial investing. The first objective is to incorporate ESG considerations as a proxy for long-term financial performance, which I think is a very legitimate and valid objective, but it aims ultimately at achieving higher returns by investing in companies' projects that perform to high ESG standards. That is quite a different objective from those investors who actually want to incentivize the investee to undertake environmental, social governance performance beyond requirements and are willing to, in a sense, forego some returns in order to provide that incentive for the investee. In those cases, there's actually an acceptance that ESG frameworks may lead to a lower financial return. So that just shows we need transparency, we need openness about objectives. Then let's come to the underlying ESG issues. They are diverse and complex. Local pollution issues versus global pollution. Corruption, labor practices. All these are legitimate concerns, but they have a local context. And therefore, it is extremely difficult to, in particular, aggregate performance on these very different aspects. If the only objective is financial performance, yes, then some aggregation of all these risks may be desirable and necessary. But if there's an intrinsic concern about environmental and social performance, then a set of standards could be more meaningful, and I think is the direction in which many actors are going, rather than an aggregate rating of performance across many different ESG dimensions. Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are a very special case. In a way, they're easier because here there's a globally comparable set of emissions, because 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions in one country, in one industry, can be directly compared to greenhouse gas emissions in a different country, in a different industry. So here aggregation actually is meaningful, and uniform measures can be applied. But that really holds only for global public goods like greenhouse gases, not for other ESG dimensions, where I think individual standards and performance criteria are more meaningful than aggregation. So in sum, clearly unacceptable to lie, to be intransparent, but overall it will take a while, and it will remain complex to develop agreed consensual standards on the range of very difficult to aggregate performance dimensions on environment, social, and governance.
I think that's such an important point to say, that the underlying issues are so complex that you can't just aggregate it into one number. And we need to be able to both reflect the complexity, but also, Nicholas, to your point, be able to communicate how you're doing these assessments to get transparency. Now, final question from me, and then we'll turn to the audience. So briefly, in just 1 or 2 sentences, what are some ways that we can work together to ensure that we uphold ESG integrity and produce genuine outcomes? I might stay, Nicholas and Joaquin, with you first, just to answer what are ways that we can work together to collaborate to make sure that we can produce better ESG outcomes. Nicholas?
I think there's a lot that the MDBs can do to act as pathfinders for investors that are keen to invest into sustainable infrastructure financing, but may not necessarily have the wherewithal to analyze all the underlying taxonomies, disclosures, and the science behind it, and so on and so forth. So, for example, our 30% shareholder AIIB has been an anchor investor in our BSC 2 and 3 issuances, especially in the sustainability tranches. So this provided validation to the other investors in relation to the ESG and credit profiles of our IBS portfolios. So I think that this obviously is extremely valuable for both investors and us as issuer, especially in relation to an asset class like the infrastructure asset-backed securities, which is still fairly nascent. So I look forward to working closer, I think, with the MDBs, because I believe that there's a lot that we can do together to help mobilize the institutional financial market to a greater extent.
Thank you. Briefly, Joaquin.
Well, first, we can share experience across different actors. As I said, the MDBs have 30 years of experience with attaching ESG standards to financing. So there's a wealth of experience and track record that can benefit the community. But at the same time, we as MDBs can learn from the private sector experience, which I think brings new dimensions to this debate. Secondly, by actually financing together, we can, I think, move the needle toward more commonly accepted standards. I'm delighted to be here together with Nicholas on the panel, because we are a very proud investor in Bayfront and a happy purchaser of some of these securities issued by Bayfront. I think this initiative that you talked about, I think illustrates very well how we can bring private experience, MDB experience together and develop an ESG framework that is suitable for a particular, I think, exciting new asset class that is being created for infrastructure and developing countries, where environmental and social standards are particularly important because of the high risks in this space. So we are very keen to continue this kind of co-financing, co-investing, accompanied by the development of high ESG standards.
Okay, thank you. Yulin, Sean, you get the last word on this round, but let's keep it just to a key point. Yulin, you first. What are ways that we can collaborate to have better ESG outcomes?
I think one of the recent ones we've collaborated with the academic institution, National University of Singapore, to really try to get the truth or the data out there in terms of themes, right? Whether it's climate or it's verification or how ESG is actually linked to remuneration. So that's something that we collaborated with the academic institution and, was able to offer a view about how that's going in terms of different types of sustainability dimensions across Asia Pacific. So I thought that's something that was useful that we did.
Thank you. Sean?
We face an extraordinary challenge, a species-defying challenge around climate change. We need to bring science to the table. AIIB, with our development banks, has been doing a lot of work for doing that. That will require a very clear understanding of what we must do, not what is best in class necessarily. It has got to be some absolutes here. And the MDB's work on taxonomy, if I can use that term, not the term they use, is great. And linking that with the government work that we're doing in places like China, Singapore and European Union is essential going forward. A common language about the shopping list of the future is the most essential task before us.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's pivot to some of the questions we have from the audience now. So the first one, bear with me, it's something that's come up a few times, which is about investment, particularly in coal. So while we promote the ESG in our investment, we also noted that investment in coal or other fossil fuels are still part of the development path for some low-income countries in the world to address their own energy needs. So because almost all international financial institutions, international banks, bilateral donors don't support work in this area, what are the suggestions from the panelists to these countries to get the required financing to support their development? Maybe I'll turn to Joachim first, with your perspective from AIIB.
Thank you. We don't judge countries' own energy strategies, but we have taken the decision that we don't finance coal because it is considered not aligned with the Paris Agreement, which is, after all, an agreement among all the world's countries. And we see our focus in helping countries accelerate their transition away from high carbon fossil fuels, given the just paramount threat to humanity from climate change. Now, I think luckily we have moved into a situation where alternatives to coal have become more affordable, where renewable energy sources have become competitive in many instances. And so we see our role as helping countries invest in those new low carbon energy sources and thereby accelerate their transition. Of course, each country faces a particular set of circumstances, endowments with energy resources, and the multilateral development banks are engaged with countries to help them develop long-term strategies that are appropriate for each individual country case to define a path toward a low-carbon energy future, something that all countries, again, have committed to in the Paris Agreement, and will require international solidarity among countries in terms of supporting financing for that transition.
Sean, you also mentioned, the change in approach. You mentioned from the best in class, from the DJSI for coal-fired power plants. I mean, what are you seeing from the CBI perspective?
Darian, this is an extraordinary past view. This is a 20th century view. The cost of renewables has dropped so fast, thanks to strong state action in Europe and in China, that this is not true. I beg you to find a country where a new coal-fired power station is actually cheaper than building renewables. I'm sorry, I just think that's yesterday's story. It's not today's story. So we need to catch up with what's happened here. We're finding coal-fired power stations in emerging markets that have been built over the last 20 years facing bankruptcy because, frankly, they were not the right investment decisions given the direction of renewable energy. We know that in places like South Africa and Indonesia, there's a real challenge to the profitability of the coal-fired power stations built and are being built. They are going to have to be retired early because the cost of solar in particular, is dropping 20% per annum and continues to drop. Like, it's extraordinary. So, dealing with energy supply, you might decide to build coal, even though it's more expensive because you can't build solar fast enough. I think that's a highly dubious proposition anyway. Access to land in some places can be an issue, but we have so many warehouses and buildings. Look, I'm going to say it's yesterday's comment. This is now, and that's putting aside the comments that Joachim just made, which is unfortunately the building of coal everywhere is severely damaging the world we live in. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to talk about fault. Clearly, fault around climate lies with Western economies and now China, which is contributing 30% of global emissions. Let's not say that China is somehow special here. The US worse, Europe worse, China now part of the mix. In those three geographies, we've got to reduce emissions. But that doesn't mean that we have a free slate to be able to build emissions everywhere because the challenge has gone beyond that now. We now do not have a viable future for our children as a result on current trajectories. We will see mass death in the 30s and 40s on current trajectories unless we can change the supertanker. And that requires us to make some drastic changes to our energy policy, our energy plans around the world, as well as all the other measures. But in the meantime, we're kind of lucky because that pricing argument is yesterday's story. It is cheaper and frankly easier and more equitable to build solar pretty well everywhere.
Okay, let's be future forward with our questions. Now, really quick round. I've got one more question I'll ask to Yulin and Nicholas. Really brief answer. So given the plethora of competing methodologies, how credible have ESG ratings become amongst investors who rely on this data to make their decisions? Yulin, you first.
I was actually just having a conversation on this with one of my colleagues who studies ESG ratings. So he was one of the key things is that if you compare it to say credit ratings, right, the equivalence data points is about 0.93 to 0.98, one being the perfect score. But when it comes to actually ESG, the equivalent score is actually only 0.48 to 0.58. So it's a lot lower, right? And that's, there's just really two reasons. Now, number one, which is the harmonization of the standards. And number two as well is, in relation to the quality of the data as well. Data that goes into credit risk, credit ratings are, based on international financial reporting standards, are audited as well to a very high level. That's not the same as ESG. And so I think that, as the standards and also as data quality improves, I think, ESG ratings, will improve in due time and hopefully sooner rather than later as well.
Thanks, Yulin. Nicholas, how about from your perspective? I mean, are you relying on the ESG ratings and what can we do about making sure that they're credible?
Well, I think ultimately we can draw a parallel to credit ratings as well, right? Whereby we really have to look underneath and see what are the standards and what are the methodologies being used by the specific rating agencies in assigning the specific scores. So I think in many cases, it's really just test top, right? And that's probably not sufficient in relation to assigning a credible score. It will take more similar to credit ratings to talk to the company, to dive deeper into its practices and policies, procedures, and understand where it's heading towards, to really give a credible score for that specific company or project. So I think it comes down to a methodology or an approach that takes into account engagement with the issuer or engagement with the specific company or project to really do justice to the specific ESG rating.
Okay. Joaquim, just briefly, we've got another minute. Have you got any particular perspective on the ESG ratings?
Digging deeper, I think, is the key. Avoiding artificial aggregation of indicators, I think, is important so that people understand what is actually being rated and can compare sensibly rather than just at the level of some aggregate numbers that clearly have underlying differences in methodology.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we could continue this conversation all day, but thank you so much to all of my panelists and to the Minister for Finance for his opening remarks. I've heard so many different interesting perspectives that, yes, there is a plethora of standards, but actually it's the standards that give credibility to ESG data, that we need to be science-based, that we need to be looking to the future rather than where we've been in the past, and that ESG is actually very complex, much more complex than perhaps 3 little letters would imply, and that we need to make sure that we're not over-aggregating data so that we can still pick up on that complexity to make sure that we make progress and have impact across environment, social and governance. Thank you to everyone for listening today, and thank you to AIIB for hosting this session. We wish you a successful meeting. I'm Doreen McBain, Advisor to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and thank you very much for participating. Goodbye.